Okay, so just for those people that weren't here last week, Mike kicked us off with week 1. So he introduced us to this unique looking table. So I just thought we'll quickly go back over it, because it really sets the scene of how we really unravel and work through God's plan and purpose, which is his Bible. So Mike last week talked about creation. So from creation through to Christ's birth was around 4,000 years. Okay, so what we're looking at is a timeline here. So 4,000 years of history, and then the New Testament is around about 70 years of history. And then Revelation takes us through the ages, through to where we are today and even into the future. So roughly the Bible, or the golden thread, really takes us through around about 6,000 to 7,000 years of God's plan and purpose with mankind and with the earth. Now, this is really good, this table, because as Mike last week was talking about creation, he also jumped forward in time into the New Testament, because you need to have both. You need both New and Old Testaments to get the full picture of what God's plan and purpose is with the earth. So sometimes things in the Old Testament won't make sense until you get to the New, and then the New Testament will put it into context. And also vice versa. If you just read the New Testament, there's plenty of things in there that won't make sense unless you've read the Old. So this 8-week series is going through both Old and New Testaments, and each week, just like Mike did last week, we're going to be jumping from one to the other to unpack that each week. Okay, does that make sense? It's not the words of a crazy rambling person? Good. Now, Mike also showed us these key themes. You probably can't see it from there, but the red line is the theme, a key theme that runs throughout all of both Old and New, and it's sin and death. And then there's the blue line is the theme of Jesus, and also a key term, the seed. And then there's promises and things that God reveals about the earth and also about his kingdom. So together, combine those three, you're probably thinking, but hang on, that's red, blue and green, that's not golden. This is the golden thread. Huh? I did that. So together, combine those three topics together, and that is the golden thread that weaves itself throughout the scriptures. So this week it's a pretty cool week. I love this week because the Bible is a history book, but it's also a prophetic book, which means that it looks into the future. From the time when something was written, it looks into the future. Okay, so it's a history book and a prophetic book. And the man Abraham is a key figure that links those two things very, very nicely. And we're going to have a look at that this afternoon. So I'm glad I got this topic. So Mike took us through creation. He showed us some key things about the red line. Adam and Eve, they sinned, and so we're born into this red line. But even back in creation, a promise was given that mankind would have the opportunity to get off this red line, which only leads to death because we're born into sin, and through a seed, we'll be able to get off that line. So that was really good. But what about the green line? What about the earth and the kingdom? Well, that's really going to be shown quite clearly today. So we're going to be looking roughly 1900, 2000 years. So just as we're about 2,000 years since, because we're 2025, 2,000 years since Jesus, today we're going to be looking around about 2,000 years after creation. So today we're going to be having a look at the flood and more especially about Abraham. So that's around about a 400 to 500 year period after 2,000 years past creation for about 400 to 500 years is what we're going to be looking at today. Okay, so Mike introduced us to God's mission statement last week. And that was the whole purpose, and it's not just in Habakkuk, it's throughout the scripture. God's plan and purpose with creation was to receive honour and glory, and that was to be seen with the earth being filled with his knowledge and with his glory. So fast forward about 2,000 years, roughly 2,000 years from this fall in creation, and we come across a character in Scripture called Noah. You can read for yourself in Genesis 6 and 7, conditions in the earth was the exact polar opposite. Does that make sense? Polar, or is it exact? Exact opposite to what God's mission statement was. The earth was completely filled with just sin. God wasn't acknowledged at all. So God had a look at the state of mankind and with the earth, and actually says that he regretted creating mankind because it was that sinful and it was that bad. And so he decides that he's going to wipe out creation with using water, using a worldwide flood. So enter in a man called Noah. He was the only man, the only righteous man that was seen on the earth at that time, which is pretty sad. He came from the line of Seth, which was one of Adam's sons, and he was commissioned for over 100 years to preach to the people, to let them know what was coming. And unfortunately, Noah would have been seen as a bit of a madman because it had actually never rained on the earth. And I think there's some verses that come up, well, we won't read it out today, but there's verses in the New Testament that make it clear that in Noah's day, it had actually never rained. Anyway, so God gave him specifications to build an ark to save some animals and his family, and then the rest is history. So the size of the ark, if anybody's keen, was larger than a footy field, and I believe, I haven't done much research, but I believe that engineers that know about boat building say that the exact measurements was the perfect size for stability to be able to withstand a flood. So if you read Genesis 7 or 8 and 8, we find out that even though it took 100 years to build, and he was preaching, God closed the door and the depths, the water came up from the earth, and it also rained, and it quickly flooded the earth, and anybody not inside the ark died. So it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. They were in the ark for over a year, and then after God had wiped away sin from the earth using the flood, notice the colour of this verse. Notice that it's green. Does anybody remember a green line before? Genesis 9 verse 11, God makes a very important promise that he will never destroy the earth through flood again. So now we're just going to quickly jump to the New Testament. Peter, the Apostle Peter, actually talks about the flood, and he makes the comparison that just as Noah was saved by the ark, so baptism saves us. So this is a bit of a golden thread moment, but stay tuned. So remember that, because in weeks 6 and 7, we're going to find out a lot more about baptism. Okay, so back to the story. So we find here around about the year 2348 that God introduces the promise of the earth that he will never destroy it again. Okay, so even though it didn't really take too long for God to regret creating mankind, about 2,000 years later, he destroyed mankind off the earth except for one man and his family. You'd think that now that with this fresh start, Noah and his family, his 3 sons and their wives, you'd think that we're going to get it right this time. Because we know that God takes sin seriously. He's got a plan and purpose with the earth, and that's about his knowledge and his glory. If that's not happening, God takes that very seriously. So, what happens after the flood? God tells Noah and his sons to populate the earth and to spread out. Fast forward around about 100 years later, mankind hasn't spread out. It's just like, you know what, we're going to do things our way. So this is 100 years, only 100 years after the flood, and straight away, sin, that red line of sin, is still very strong within us. So they congregate into a city, and they decide to build a great big building up into the air. We don't need to spread out, we're going to make a big city, we can all stay all together. Why do you think they've built a massive, great big building that goes up towards the heavens? Have a guess. Yeah, but God just promised that, but they know that if we sin, God's going to do something, so we'll take matters into our own hands. Even though God said that he wouldn't flood the world again, just in case he changes his mind, let's build up. That's that red line of sin coming through again. So God, being the creator and sustainer of all things, instead of flooding the earth because he promised he wouldn't, he confuses the language. And that's what Babel means. The Tower of Babel is about confusion. So mankind moved and shifted with the people that they could speak with. I don't know how many different languages there were, but from that point on, mankind actually finally did, through being forced, because their language was confused, but they actually started to move out throughout the earth. Okay, so one of Noah's sons his name was Shem. Around about 9 generations after Shem, we come across a character in the Bible by the name of Abram. And you can see up there on the screen where he came from. It's probably just interesting to note before we go on about the story with Abram that he lived a pretty good life. They lived in a very, very rich and self-sustaining area in a land called Ur. And Ur of the Chaldees, archaeologists and historians believe, was at the top of education and farming and things like that. So Abram was well off. He had a pretty cushy life. And just in case you're wondering what cuneiform writing is, that means they believe that they found years ago evidence of, it's where they get little wedges of either stone or wood, and they would make letters. Not similar to English, of course, probably a bit maybe Chinese, I'm not sure, just guessing. But that's what cuneiform is. It's little wedges that they make marks with, and they were able to read and communicate using that. So God picks out Abram and tells him to do something that is very unique. God tells Abram, who lives in this prosperous area called Ur of the Chaldees, he says, I want you to pack up your stuff, move your family. I'm not going to tell you where you're going, but I want you to move. So Abram at the time, over the course of time, moves up to Haran, he comes down, goes into Egypt and comes back. And just where you see the little, the word Bethel, we're going to come back to that city shortly. So you have to ask yourself, why Abram? Why Abraham? Why did this one man get picked from a very rich and prosperous area? And not only that, but why did Abram all of a sudden just obey God without even knowing where he's going and what God's plan and purpose with him was? Again, we have to jump forward to the New Testament to find out. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out to a place which he should receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out not knowing whither he went. So Abram at the time, knew of God, he believed in God, so much so that he was willing to uproot his life and leave and go somewhere that he didn't even know where he was headed. That's how much faith that he had. And because of this faith of Abraham, God gave him a series of promises, which really is the key to our topic today. In Genesis 12, God makes a promise to Abraham that has 4 parts, that he would make Abraham, who didn't even have a son at this stage, he was going to produce a great nation from Abram, would make his name great in the earth, bless those who bless him, and bless all nations through him. Now, at this stage, we're not going to be necessarily looking specifically at that highlighted section, but we're definitely going to be coming back to the end, coming back to this section towards the end of this afternoon. So 4 parts. It's all about blessings and growing a nation from Abram. Okay, so when it's talking about this nation, making him a great nation, when it's talking about the seed of Abram, who is that actually talking about? Well, the answer is really given to us last week by Brother Mike. Remember how Mike gave us, when he was talking about the history of the Bible and all the different writers and how it was produced and all the books of the Bible, from Genesis all the way through to the Old Testament is all focused on the history of one nation in particular, and that nation came from Abraham. And that nation, can anybody tell me what they were called? Israel. And where did the name Israel come from? Whose name was changed to Israel? Jacob. And who was Jacob related to? Yeah, up the back? Abraham. Yeah, he was a great-grandson. Sorry, he was the grandson of Abraham. So the Bible is all about the Jews, about the nation of Israel, which came from Abraham. And even these authors, they're all Jews, they're Israelites. The apostles were Israelites. Jesus was an Israelite. And it's not until we get a little bit further on that we find out that it's also other nations also get introduced to this being God's people. Anyway, that was a little side note. So the Bible is a Jewish history book. It's an Israeli history book. And that's come about from Abraham. Okay. If you do have a Bible in your hands, let's get used to turning its pages. Let's get into Genesis chapter 13, because this is a pretty powerful one. This is the second promise that was given to Abram after he separated with his nephew Lot. Lot chose the plains of Sodom because it was very prosperous. It was lots of water and farmlands, and it was rich. And Abram gave him the first option about where Lot wanted to go. And because Abram did that, this is the promise that God makes to him. We pick it up in Genesis 13, starting at verse 14. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are. Okay, so just pause there. So Abraham, or Abram right now, is around that town. Remember how we said the city of Bethel? So Bethel is up in the mountains. And so they could see from Bethel down to the plains of Sodom. So Abram is being told by God in Bethel, round Bethel, where was I? I want you to look northward, southward, eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, which would have been a lot because he's up high, he can look around, all the land that you can see, I'm going to give to you and to your descendants forever. All right. You can keep reading that in your own time. So, it's pretty interesting that God got Abraham to look around. So this promise, what was this promise all about? You're into real estate. I just gave you the answer. It was all about real estate. Where was somewhere that God didn't tell Abraham to look? Didn't tell him to look up. He didn't say that's where your future promise is for you. It was land. It was all about land. So you know where we're heading with this? Remember the lines up on the timeline? So so the promise was that you're going to inherit this land forever, and also your offspring, your seed, will also inherit this land forever. However, we know that Abraham never actually got to inherit it. which we're going to answer this afternoon, because that's quite strange that he's been made a promise that he was going to inherit the land forever, and he actually didn't get to do it. So right now, what have we covered this afternoon, just before we have a coffee break? We've been promised that the earth will never be destroyed, specifically by flood, which is nice to hear, isn't it? Because God's mission statement is all about the earth being filled with the knowledge of his glory. So that's good. The earth was created for a purpose, and it's here to stay. God's not going to do that again. He also made a promise to Abraham that he was going to have a lot of seed, a lot of descendants, and we know that from the children of Israel, and we're going to unpack that over the next couple of weeks. But then we also get a promise that Abraham and his seed were going to inherit this green line forever. Not just for 100 years or 1,000 years, it was going to be forever. So that's what after we come back from our afternoon, did I say morning tea before? When we come back from our afternoon tea, that's what we're going to be looking at this afternoon, about how does this work? Because, like, all due respect to Abraham and to the Israelites, that's great, but how do I get a slice of the action? How does this relate to me, or to us in here who are not Israelis? What does this mean to us? Let's have a break. All right, so we'll now pick up from the third particular promise that was made to Abraham. Well, at this stage, I believe Abram's name has been changed to Abraham, which means he was to be the father of many nations. And I really encourage everybody to read the whole story in Genesis. It's the way it unfolds is spectacular. It's awesome. Okay, so the specific third promise made to Abraham is really about what Graham is going to be taking us through next week, through the story of Moses and the children of Israel. So this is a short-term promise that God made to Abraham that was going to be fulfilled quite quickly, as opposed to the other promises that some of them haven't even been fulfilled yet. But the third promise, let's get into it. Abraham's seed would be a stranger in a foreign land for 400 years. They would serve others until the fourth generation, until they were delivered. And also, he was told the land that he looked at when he was up the mountain earlier is given more of a defined boundaries, I guess, of the promised land that was to be given to the children of Israel. So, stay tuned what that's all about next week. Okay, so we've gone through quite a few different promises that was given to Abram. Let's work out what's happening. So, I'll get a bit of crowd participation here. Was he given many descendants? Yeah, definitely. The children of Israel, awesome. God would bless them that bless him. If you read the account in the Old Testament with God dealing with his people, the nations that were good to Israel, God blessed them. And for those that were against Israel, God was against them. So yes, I'd say the second one was fulfilled as well. Have all nations been blessed through Abraham? No. No, they haven't. We'll come back to that because that was one of the sections of the promise that we highlighted earlier. Abram's descendants were able to enjoy the victory over their enemies, yes, for a period of time, until their sinful ways meant that God turned his back on them for a moment in time. So yes and no. And he and his descendants given the land forever? No. They were in Israel. We'll find out this as we go through the golden thread over the next couple of weeks. They got into the land that was promised to Abraham. However, when they disobeyed God over time, God used other nations to take them away as captives. So no, and it's only been recent that they're back in Israel, but do they really own the land in Israel right now, the Israeli people? I don't think so. There's plenty of aggression towards them and unrest. So I didn't have to tell you all that. We could have just gone to the New Testament, because it makes it quite clear in Hebrews that all these faithful men and women in the Bible, including Abraham and his sons, they're all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what they were promised. They didn't receive the inheritance of the land forever. They didn't receive it. And in Acts, Paul writes specifically about Abraham that he gave him no inheritance here, not even enough ground to set his foot on, but God promised him that he and his descendants after him would possess the land, even though at that time Abraham had no child. So something strange is going on here. Where do these promises stand? Does this mean that because the children of Israel turned their back and rejected God so often, does that mean that God has turned his back on his promises? And let's ask the question, are the Israelis or the Jewish people, are they still God's people? Because there's plenty of people out there which would say no. Because week 6, they killed Jesus. Just quietly, if you don't know that story, in week 6 we're going to find out God's own people killed Jesus. So are they still part of these promises? Isaiah 43, through the prophet Isaiah, God says that the Israelis are my witnesses. So when you see an Israeli, that's evidence that God is. Ye are my witnesses, says God, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. So if anybody questions, is there really a God? God says, look at a Jewish person, look at an Israelite, and that's evidence that I exist. Which is pretty good evidence when you consider the Jewish history of all the things that they've gone through. Even in modern times, they are still here today. They're still a nation, which is a miracle. The Apostle Paul, he must have had questions coming from the believers in Rome. He writes this about the Israelites. I say then, hath God cast away his people? That's a question that we just asked just today. Definitely not, he says, or other words, God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin, and so all Israel shall be saved. As it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant unto them, when I shall take away their sins. So God, through Isaiah, says, doesn't matter what happens, Israelites, they're my witnesses. And even thousands of years later, the Apostle Paul says to the believers in Rome that God has not, he definitely has not cast away his people. So that's all well and good. So we know that the Jewish people, the promises made about the Jewish people still exist, but we still have some key questions that we need to answer. Why haven't the promises made back to Abraham in the day, why haven't they been fulfilled? And also, as I said before the break, what does that mean to me? How can I be a part of these promises? Where do we fit in? Okay, so let's have a look. We said before, Mike introduced us about God's mission statement about the earth, and we put it to you this afternoon that the promises made to Abraham has a direct link to God's plan and purpose with the earth. So the promise to Abraham was that all nations shall be blessed through Abraham. So how does this work? How does this unfold? Because Abraham didn't inherit the land forever because he's dead. Same with Isaac, same with Jacob. All the worthies of old, all the worthies that are mentioned in Hebrews 11, they didn't receive the promises that were made to them because they're dead. So something has to happen. And the Bible is very clear on what that something is. And that is where the resurrection will occur. So people that are dead in the ground will be raised from the dead at the return of Jesus. And that's a fundamental teaching not just in the New Testament, but also in the Old. So one example in the Old Testament is Daniel, and he says in his writings that many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. And we'll look at more at that in week 8 of this series. And 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 16, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. And just in case you're wondering, oh yeah, that's 2 verses out of the whole Bible, there's plenty more verses. 1 Corinthians 15, there's many verses in the Bible that talk about the resurrection. So that's part of the answer. So Abraham will be raised from the dead, and because he's been promised the land forever, we can assume that he will inherit sometime in the kingdom. When the kingdom comes, he'll inherit that. So how does Jesus play a part of this? So when you look at Matthew 1, and we're going to look at this a little bit further in week 6 of this series, Matthew 1 verse 1 starts off with these very words, the book of the generation of Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So here we have a direct link that Jesus is the direct seed of Abraham. And then Galatians 6 in particular really helps us to unlock what is meant by these promises and the seed of Abraham inheriting the earth forever. So those that have got their Bibles, let's have a quick look at Galatians 3, starting at verse 16. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Jesus. So by using Galatians, the Apostle Paul knew quite clearly that yes, there was the promise made of the seed of Abraham being about the Jews, but in this case it's more specific and it's talking about Jesus. So somehow Jesus is the link to untying this promise that is yet to happen. Galatians 3 verse 27 says, for as many of you as been baptised into Jesus have put on Jesus, and when that happens, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, for you are all one in Jesus. And if you are Jesus, or if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. There's neither Jew nor Greek. So we're not Jews, we're Gentiles, but it's saying here that if we put on Christ through baptism, then we are directly linked to the promise made to Abraham about the earth owning it forever. Now, I'm not going to go too much into baptism because that's week 6 and week 7, specifically more week 7. But baptism here is the key. So what other story have we thought about today or considered today where water was used to wash away sin? The flood with Noah. And it's saying that baptism is very similar. Or it's the same for us. Through baptism we can wash away our sins, and by doing that, that ties us. We start a new life in Jesus, and if we belong to Jesus, then we belong to Abraham's seed. So, the promise made to Abraham, we've already seen this, that's talking about his seed, which were the Israelis, but also in this instance, it's more specifically talking about Jesus. And Abraham was also promised that he would inherit, and his seed or his descendants would inherit the earth forever. And we can become part of that, as Galatians 3 states, by belonging to Jesus, identifying as belonging to Jesus, becoming Christians through baptism. See how you need to have both old and new, because without the New Testament, those promises don't mean anything to us. And without the Old Testament, Galatians 3, what's it actually talking about? So to put it in context, you need both. It's just beautiful how that golden thread weaves throughout both old and new for a continuous story that makes up God's plan and purpose for the earth. Okay, so what is the link between God's mission statement with the earth and to the promise made to Abraham? Who can tell me? What's the missing link? What joins them together? Yeah, it's Jesus. And Mike talked about Jesus last week, about the promise made about the seed of the woman. So Jesus really is part of this golden thread that weaves throughout scriptures. Okay, so what have we covered this afternoon for week 2? We've had a look that Abraham was a man of faith. He obeyed God and followed God's request of leaving his country. And because of that, and other times when Abraham proved faith to God by following God's commands, God gave him more specific information about what those promises meant. And this promise that was made even comes down through to us today. So, to inherit the land forever, you need to be able to overcome death. To overcome death, you need to be tied to Jesus. So the descendant of Abraham that unlocks all of this is Jesus Christ. And we can become part of those promises by being baptised. And if Abraham has been promised the land or the earth forever, then if we're related to him through Jesus, then those promises specifically relate to us as well. And we're going to see in week 8, a couple of weeks from now, we're going to see what that picture of the kingdom and living on the earth like forever, what that actually will look like, using the Old Testament as well. So next week, Brother Graham is going to pick up a couple of hundred years after Abraham, talking about Moses and the Israelites being in Egypt, and he'll unpack how that all works out in week 3 of the Golden Thread. So before we close in prayer, was there any questions at all? No questions? Feel free to hang around for, is there more chocolates, more ice cream cones? Tammy?
There's
4 left?
3 left.
Awesome. Well, feel free to hang around if you like for some more food. I don't think